The third activity under step 3 is all about organic waste treatment. There are two main reasons why you should focus on this activity and why it is important. The first one is that organic waste is not entering your waste collection system and the final disposal site. The second one is that the community has a clear understanding of what is organic waste and how it can be treated, and what is inorganic waste and how it should be treated. For the activities, what you should do is first you should really survey the local best practices on organic waste treatment. That is really important because you can use this in all further discussions and implementation of treatment methods to find the most local and applicable solution. The second one is that you start then working with a committee which you created to use the best practices which you have and slowly start to grow them. Find more households who are willing to participate and slowly get the whole village to use the best practices in the village. This is a continuous activity. Also, it is actually a standalone activity. So even if you cannot do anything else in the village, you can still work with individuals in the village on organic waste treatment. So you would start in areas where you have already the best practice, and then from there slowly to grow it throughout the whole village. So you start with piloting in the beginning. You definitely should include the waste committee. Maybe there is also some individuals in the village who really like to work on organic waste, so try to include them as well. The material for this activity are really depending on the local conditions and how they actually set up the organic waste treatment system. Before we start thinking about treatment options of organic waste, I want to emphasize why this is so important. So when we look here at waste composition of waste in the rural areas, we see organic waste makes roughly 90% of the waste which is generated. Half of this is coming from the garden, which are leaves, branches, and the other half is then mainly food waste. When we would collect this waste as well, our collection system has to be at least 10 times more. In that way, it is really important to make sure that organic waste is not entering your collection system. Let's start with garden waste. Garden waste, this is mostly leaves and branches, as you can see here. In rural areas, especially here in tropical climates, there is quite a lot of garden waste generated. So in this case here, it is kind of piled up somewhere in the garden. So the problem with the existing practice here is that it also gets polluted with plastic. So household waste is also just dumped directly on the garden waste because finally from their position is, okay, this is all waste and it will be finally burned. So in that way, since these two wastes are treated together, it becomes a much larger environmental issue. To solve this, we are trying to promote the, let's say, 3 most simple and basic forms of composting methods which are actually available. So the first one is what we call just leave it. Since it is organic material and it's a humid climate, it will decompose anyway after a short amount of time, a year maybe. The other form of composting is called a pit composting method, that is mostly just a hole where everything is put in, or frame composter, which is basically something which is built on top of the ground. Now let's have a look at these a little bit closer. Pit or pile composting, as you can see here in the picture, is maybe one of the most common methods to treat organic material, and it could be, or I'm actually quite sure that in the areas where you will work, some of the households will use the one or the other methods already. So what has to be done is just that all the organic material is put together on one pile or into one pit, and in the dry season it should be watered frequently so that the decomposition is a little bit increased. So here on the right side now you see a pit also here from Myanmar, and normally what the households are doing, they sweep just everything from the compound together and then finally sweep it into the pit. The problem is only that you cannot really see it here, that they also sweep other waste into the pit. So when are people littering plastics or other inorganic waste on the compound, it is also swept into the pit, and at some point when the amount of plastic becomes too high, then this will cause a problem and the decomposition cannot happen probably anymore. When it is not possible to use a pit, maybe because there is too much rainfall and will be too much water flowing into the pit, going in the opposite direction is also an option, and that is what we call normally a frame composter. So this one is a very simple one, just built from old fishing net around a tree and then filled up with all organic waste from the garden. But they can be very different designs. So this one here is an even smaller one, just made from bamboo, and it can hold a small amount of organic material, but it can be basically constructed around every tree in the garden. A composting unit made a little bit larger can be constructed from steel mesh. This is very cheap and very easy to set up, and we use this kind of method mostly in more urban contexts. So here the organic material takes roughly 3 to 6 months to decompose. Kitchen waste is the other organic waste you have to deal with. If you're lucky, you don't need to do anything, since, at least in our cases, often kitchen waste is used as food for animals, specifically pigs. It is managed fully sustainably already and does not need any further attention. However, when kitchen waste is not managed in that way, it can be quite of a headache. The first concern you have is that all the waste which is generated in the kitchen, meaning food waste but also plastic, is mixed together and then just disposed in the garden or in a nearby river. The second problem is when you actually set up a waste collection system and people want to dispose of their kitchen waste, you need to completely rethink the way how you are collecting waste. So when there is kitchen waste in the waste, you need to collect the waste maybe every second, if you're lucky, every third day. While when kitchen waste is not entering your collection system and you're dealing actually only with plastic and some other inorganic waste, then you can collect the waste once per week, every second week. So here you have a real problem, and it creates a lot of pressure on your waste collection system when you want to dispose of kitchen waste with your collection system. The third one, which you really have to think about, is when you want to use an incineration plant at your dump site and you are collecting kitchen waste, then this will heavily reduce the burning temperature of your incinerator, and the generation of black carbon is much higher. The most common and probably also the most sustainable way of managing kitchen waste is by feeding it to animals. And that is not only pigs, it can be dogs, ducks, chicken, whatever is actually existing in the village. The next best option is to dispose your food waste together with your garden waste in some form of a composter. This is okay for most of the food waste except for maybe some bones or very oily and spicy food. However, at least from our experience, we do not see that this is a big issue, as most of the food, leftover food, comes from kitchen cut off rather than really food leftovers. Moving the habit away from burning the waste on their compound to composting is sadly not that easy. Let's talk about a few actions which we learned are useful. The first one is that the committee start themselves making compost on their own ground, depending on the best practices already available in the village. From there, the committee should further try to convince other stakeholders like markets or religious institutions, schools, and public buildings also to build composting units on their facilities. Then another more interesting approach, which we learned also work in urban areas, is that during the training, the awareness training which you will have with the community, you can start incentive program where you would pay each household who is willing to set up this kind of composting unit. So in that way you can create another form of incentive for the community to start this kind of activity. Another way would be also to create a community compost. So for example, next to the final dump site, you can have just an open space where people can dump off all their organic material and just leave it there. And after 1 or 2 years, it will be fully decomposed and can be used as fertilizer by the community. So these are the different options which you can try, but all of them take a decent amount of time simply because making compost takes so long. So you need actually at least half a year of supporting the community so that slowly the uptake of making compost is improving. Sadly, there are a decent amount of challenges to setting up organic waste treatment all over the village. So let's look at garden waste first. The first one is that the community is just used to burn their garden waste, since this is the traditional method here, and so changing this is not so easy. The second one is that they are often afraid of pests, even snakes, in these piles of garden waste. So this is another obstacle to kind of make them to actually build them. A third one is that for them, garden waste looks dirty. So in that way, they want to get rid of it as soon as possible, and burning is just the easier option than putting it into piles and letting it rot for sometimes a year. So to our experience, you can try a few things. So first, in all the setups of composting, you should keep in mind, keep it simple. Look at the least labor-intensive kind of setup. Try to have the least amount of infrastructure. So use what local materials are available to set up the organic waste treatment activities. Be as decentral as possible. Do not have a common composting pile. This probably will not work. So try to be individual. And as I said also before, try to be as local as possible. So focus on the existing local solutions and try to multiply them throughout the village. What could also help is when you find a way that the composting activities are integrated with their own gardening activities. So as you saw in Seacone Village when they built the organic waste composter around a tree. So in that way, this becomes one. Gardening and composting becomes one, and you can be sure that at this moment it is much more sustainable actually.